Hi, everybody. My name is Lynn Frank. You might remember me as another individual in the community. I'm still that same person. We can talk about more of that if that confuses you in any way, shape, or form. I'm a software developer, or at least that's what I call myself sometimes. So it's nice of you to all have me here inside of this tiny room for us to go over these things. The reason I mention that is I'm a software developer is because I'm one of the children of summer. You know, work isn't hard for me. I just push code and then you all have to deploy it, right? That's how it works. That's not how it's worked for me, at least in my life, or at least how I've experienced it. I mean, a lot of companies I've been to, I have always been interested in let's make that process better. But I'm not very good at that all the time. I make mistakes. I think about it sometimes from the one job that I had. First-time software development, I'm releasing this website out into production. I am promising sub-second returns on most of the calls, incredible performance gains. I'm so proud of this release. They get it out in production, and within a few minutes, we have to roll it back. It turns out, to get into some of the details of it, it turns out that Memcache can only accept objects of, at least at the time, 1 megabyte or smaller, unless you recompile it to 2 megabytes, or as much as they would go up to. When using caching in my local Rails website on my system, it was using my file system, not a memory store. And so I am in front of the operations person for the first time at the organization shortly a few weeks into being at the company saying, I can make everything better by making everything worse and committing our first rollback possible. So later when I go up to that individual and said, hey, I would like to introduce some Capistrano scripts and some other tooling to help us do our deploys. They'll be efficient, fast, repeatable. You won't have to spend a whole Thursday, a 4-hour window doing the install. They said no. And I can understand why. Who would trust me after that mistake? And I felt like I was right, but I just left it. 3 Chef Summits ago, this person came up to me and said hi, and then gave me a big hug and said my 3 favorite words that I love to hear. Probably the 3 favorite words most humans love to hear, when you're talking to another human. You were right. They had found Chef and automation and really pushing a lot of those things in their new organization. They told me the tale of things. And of course, it felt so good. I was like, I knew I was right. I knew it. And that's why I love InSpec. That's why we're here today. I hope to spend some time being right. I mean, testing frameworks are a fun place to work. I don't know how I could do any of the work that I do without something to tell me that I'm doing it right. I didn't have a lot of parents, involved in my life. So, it's nice to get feedback from someone, at least in this case, the computer, even if it's red all the time. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. I just wanted to give a quick assessment to figure out who should all be here in terms of also sort of covering the material or sort of showing a little bit about the material that I'm going to cover. So here's a question, or 6 questions spread across 2 slides. And the questions are, let's just say this. You can't really see that source code, but I am going to pull it up here on my local version of InSpec that I have installed. This is InSpec. This is the source code. This is maybe I shouldn't say anything at all. Looking at this source code, just quickly, briefly, sort of looking at the words. You don't even have to understand it. The whole point is, even if you don't, you're in a good spot. If you start to, or you understand a lot of these things, that's where the questions come in. Don't worry. I mean, you can sit back and relax. I don't need anyone to raise hands or get involved, yell out, or cry. It's okay. The important part, say, looking at the code, if you were to look at it, do you understand how it works? Would you feel confident troubleshooting an issue? Would you feel confident making a change? Okay. If you said no to maybe one of those or anything like that, that means you're probably in a good spot. If you said yes to all 3, you're like, yep, I could do that. You might benefit later from watching the recording or something like that. But here, one last set of questions before you leave the door, because you feel like you know it all. Could you explain how this works to someone else? To a coworker, to a team member? Could you explain troubleshooting remotely to someone, like over Slack through text or through a video chat or something like that? How about explain how to make a change? The similar questions, but more of like that network externality, like the net promoter score or something like. Could you show someone else how to do this? Okay, I'll take that as you're all here, and you need to be here, and that's wonderful. I want to keep it less talking, so I want to get right into the code stuff, but I'll spend just a brief moment to cover a few different things. This is our agenda for the day. In the short amount of time that we have, I'm going to do a lot of live coding, so I just want to make sure that we have a chance for that. During that coding time and all that, you're welcome to just yell out things if you see a typo, want to tell me how to do things. I'm okay with some of those things. I might even call out for help at some moment because I might be missing something in a moment of panic, or I get really excited on a tangent. The few reasons why I wanted to teach or share information about like InSpec resources is because I want you to all be a better maintainer. I spent enough time in this community, and I have realized that a lot of us have been avoiding learning particular topics, perhaps like the underlying topics of, say, like the Ruby language. And I think in a lot of cases that's hurting you if you continue to tell yourself, I don't need to learn Ruby, I don't need to have any experience with it as far as like a programming language. I think eventually you are going to be running into a lot of trouble. You're going to have to get a lot of support from a lot of people, and that might cost you some money, or the people might not even be available. I just mean to say that I think you could be a better maintainer if you're able to answer some of those questions, like can I troubleshoot this? Can I make a change to this? Can I open up even even describe the error message in detail in an issue that I'm going to submit to the repository? Some of those things are really important skills, and I think a lot of that is going to make us as a community a lot better, particularly if everything is open source. All right. I also was hoping, I'm a bit of I don't want to say tidy freak in some way. But like I like things that are all kind of neatly organized and all that. So like I get really excited when I think about the idea of like making things more succinct, like telling a better story, being clearer to the user when they're using it. Some cases this might be at odds, right? So a lot of this stuff I might show you today might not be the appropriate action to take because you have a very specific requirement that says in the compliance doctrine in which you're adhering to, it might be like, we need to make sure you can explicitly see a very clear command. And what I'm going to be describing today is a little bit of obfuscation, hiding things for the purposes of readability. Now, in some cases, it might actually make things clearer. Maybe making things like this is actually better for your compliance team, allows you to collaborate a little bit easier, creates some reuse so you don't have to rebuild these essential resources every single time or rebuild things every profile you're working with. Lastly, like I mentioned, I wanted to make sure that you have some understanding of the Ruby language. It's sort of the thing that I have. I spend a lot of time teaching it, so of course, it feels like I should keep talking about it. But I just like it a lot. All right, that's a short sort of motivation thing. I'm going to do some quick sort of demonstration of the workflow in terms of activity, just to kind of give you an idea. I also feel like anytime I do a recording, I feel like what I should do is probably give you the version that I'm working with because that's something that I hate more than anything. But bear with me as I go through this introduction of things. So if you haven't been using InSpec or if you're just a little bit familiar with InSpec, welcome and all that. Most of you probably have the experience, understand it, maybe have gone through a workshop, a quick start tutorial, something like that. But it's installed from a number of locations, which is kind of interesting because it's a Ruby project, so you can install it as a gem, but of course, there may be a community distribution that you'll eventually be installing with it, but likely it's probably some sort of binary built by Chef. Eventually, you get some sort of executable on your command line that you can run commands with, right? So I can run InSpec help, and InSpec help is going to give me a bunch of different details. I just want to do that to make sure that we all know what version I currently happen to be using. All right. Oh, inside of the directory that I don't want to be. All right. Great, 4.3.2. I really like that number because that's the cost of a double fries and a soda back in 1996 when I worked at In-N-Out Burger, 432. Just kind of works really well in my head. All right, so that's kind of the idea here. So I just ran a command. You saw the result of that command. I talked about running InSpec version, and there we are. We have a value, and that kind of solves our first thing, okay? So let's actually go into like creating some sort of resource, this time a Git resource. And the only reason I'm focusing on Git as a resource is I bet most of us are using Git as a source control manager or something like it. And most of us probably know very little about our source control manager. As someone that has spent a number of years working with it now, it is only recently that I've learned about Git submodules and how they work in a very detailed way. There's so much more to that tooling that always eludes me. So it's fun to kind of like come up with an excuse to learn two things. In this case, InSpec resources and something like InSpec resources, and in this case, like Git as a resource. Okay. So InSpec as a language has a number of different ways we can, has a lot of different things in it. I kind of just pointed out like 3 things about it. But if you think about InSpec, there's a lot to it. There's a test runner, essentially the thing that just runs InSpec. It also is a generator and a bunch of other things, and it can handle plugins. So it's it's an omnibus of excitement and fun. It's also really slow because it's Ruby when you run it on a Windows system. It also has an expectation framework, and it has the ability to express resources. The expectation framework comes from another language called RSpec. That's how we get a lot of like the ways to express things, expectations in terms of that. We also have the resources, which I think are the probably most fun part, and that's why I wanted to spend some time with it. These resources are like core to our system, and so they're a way that we can like interact with our system or the systems that we're targeting. Cool. All right. I promise you it's going to get fast and furious soon. So this is how we might sort of solve the problem of like getting a Git version on our system. Let me just do that. I'll get the Git version on my system. But what I want to do is actually write a control that will actually test that thing for me. So I think I actually made a Git directory already. That's all I was going to do in terms of like creating a profile. This is a brand new profile that I just generated. And the reason I'm doing this, let's ignore that. The reason I'm doing this is because I just want to walk through a beginning case of just sort of show you everything. Now, if I was to be, and I have power mode enabled. Does it show up the little sparkly flares? I essentially have the GeoCities of editors at this point, and Visual Studio Code let me do it. Okay, yeah, I need like the little animated GIFs of some sort. All right, I'm going to do, not caps. I'm going to set up an expectation. And in that expectation, I'm just going to perform the operation that I would normally do to get the job done if I needed to make sure that a particular Git version was on the system. Oops. Great. Here we are. I have an expectation. I'm saying that it's, in this case, the standard out. The command object is a pretty powerful one. It does a lot of things. And at the end of the day, most of the time, you're probably getting to a command object at at some point it's reaching down to that level. Should be, let's just say match. I think that's a good one. I'll guess some numbers, or what did I say here? 2.2, 20.1. Yeah, that's how we make a real test. Okay, I'm going to rerun this. I'm going to run it in the terminal that's inside of Visual Studio Code, so maybe I don't tab away a lot. But if it becomes a little too cramped, I might move out of there. Okay. There's so many interesting tool choices. Okay. I'm inside the profile itself, so I'm going to use the period, which means just load yourself and execute. So there's me performing that work. Yay, right? I got to get version. Now imagine, because we're just going into this sort of gold plating, let's build a custom resource thing, let's try to solve this problem. I like to solve this problem initially with sort of like a dream-driven development way. Like, I'm going to write the thing that I think that I want, and then I'm going to let some error messages be my guide. You could also call this test-driven development, because when you're in a test framework and you're writing things, you're essentially just doing test-driven development from the beginning. So let's just copy this a little bit, mostly to save me from typing the describes. I'm going to change the command object to a Git object. I'm going to remove all this stuff about version, and I'm going to change this standard out to version. And I'm going to say, yes, it's got to be the same thing. So this doesn't exist. And it's actually really important that I try this. Like, type that out and run it, because maybe the Git resource does exist, right? And I could just stop the talk, close the laptop, and we could just go on to the next session. I don't have to build anything. I've noticed that actually in different projects. Like, I make an assumption that something does exist. I spend a bunch of time building it, and then it turns out, oopsie, but my resume is much longer now. Like, it's appropriate. That's what they call resume-driven development. Other, like prayer-driven development. I just hope this works. Okay. You'll see here we're going to get a variety of error messages, and I like error messages, and all of you like error messages, because an error message is better than nothing. I don't know what you were thinking, Linux, with this whole, like, no output is good. That means something. They probably had parents that loved them. I don't know. Generally, you're going to get a stack trace. The stack trace at the bottom is going to give you the information. A lot of times it says file, and if you ever see a colon, it usually means what's that number afterwards? It's a line number. If that's new to you, it's incredibly valuable information. Problem is getting a lot of these passes is really hard, so we're not worried about it. So we'll just focus on the last little error here. And what it's saying is that I have an undefined local variable or method named Git, essentially present within this spec file that I'm working with. Great. So this doesn't exist. It never was made. So we're going to create one. I'm going to create one inside of the libraries directory. The generator now, fortunately, creates a little one for me. I'm going to create git.rb. The name of the file doesn't matter so much. What matters is actually the content that you put within it. So I'll call it Git. Sometimes you might be like Git resource, whatever you want to do. If you think there's a collision of some sort, you might need it. I think I might need to turn power mode off in a moment, but I'll stop. Everything is going to subclass this thing called InSpec resource. It's actually this weird sort of function that returns like a definition of what a resource should look like. I'll go into some more of that later if that's important, but for the most part, the general structure of things is going to be this. I'm going to say, here's my resource, and there's the name of my resource. Now, I could write a lot more, right? There's a lot more that's based on the expectation. But I've made one change, and I love more than anything is making one change and then seeing if I can get a new error message. Yes, right? Like new error message. Thank you. So in this case, it's telling me there's an undefined method version for da-da-da-da-da. So in this case, I have some sort of weird thing. But it did find out. Like, it did find the Git thing. Now it's asking the Git thing for a version. So I'm going to implement a method onto this class. A lot of you could probably get away with some pattern matching and things like that and get pretty far. That's how I spend most of my days, just do pattern matching until I actually figure things out. That's how I became a human that was widely accepted by society. I pattern matched. Isn't that how everybody else does it? All right, I'm going to put in a version number. What are we checking for? Right here. All right. Oh, actually, let's do without the version. Let's do this. All right, let's remove the version. I'll run the test again. And here, we'll get a new error message. So it says undefined method version. Instead, what it's telling me, I expected nil to match this thing. By having an empty method in this case, I'm returning no content. No content is the same as the word nil. So thus, we don't have anything. So let's put a version number in there. That's where I'm going to just hard code the version in. And that's how you win. And you go, yes, ship, right? So now it's always reporting this version. Is that important within your organization? Maybe it is. Sometimes that works with the auditors, I've heard. Yeah, all right. But that's not the real thing. And this is the point, I think it's the hardest part. It's like how to take, maybe if you've gotten to this part, you understand some of the basic concepts of these words being in the general arrangement that they are. How do you actually make this real? I could refer to some documentation. I could open up other resources. But I hate doing that. I don't want to read other people's work. I'd rather just kind of like look at it live. Like I would rather, in some case, I wish I was like right there on line 5 at that moment in time when the code was running so I could figure out what can I do? Like what's possible at that moment, right? How can I get that version information? Could I call the command resource essentially and sort of wrap it or do all that type of stuff? That's what I want to know. Well, I could just tell you that's true. You could call the command resource. You could make this all work. But what I want to show you is actually how to do some debugging. So this thing is usually worth the price of admission if you've never seen this. It works for most every Ruby code, but it's a tool called pry. You specify require because it's a gem. You bring it in. And this works in all of like Chef cookbooks. It's going to work in all of your InSpec profiles. And then you say binding.pry. Binding is sort of like a I like to think of it from like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. Essentially just mentions like the force binds us. Binding is kind of like the DNA of everything. All Ruby objects have this sort of context, and you can refer to that context or their self by, say, binding. That essentially just sets a breakpoint. If you're familiar with like JavaScript, you just type the word debugger. It'll automatically pause at that moment. A lot of times I like to write it in like one line. It's the only time I use a semicolon in Ruby. For those of you that love semicolons, here's your chance. I'm not one of those. OK, so let's run this again. Now what's going to happen is we're going to pause the execution right at that line. And I'm spending a lot of time doing this. Again, we'll go faster as we continue. But here what you'll see is that now I get a little bit of output. It tells me like what file I'm currently in. It's going to give me a list of where I'm at in terms of like the line number for the source code. And then I have a prompt here. So previously, I was kind of like writing these letters or these messages or these calls, right? I'm typing something in, saving it, running it, getting feedback. What I have now is what I'd like to call like chatting with Ruby or chatting with InSpec or whatever happens to be. So you can get crazy here and start asking some questions or get some real-time feedback, right? It's really nice. So the first thing and most important moment, like when you're at this thing, what do you want to say? Help is always a great one. Help is not going to show a lot of things that are very clear here in the terminal, but like it's going to show you every possible command. That's great. So just so you know that when help is there. The other next important command is exit. If you're ever frustrated with everything in this breakpoint, you want to continue and get out of there, exit. I just need to make sure you know those two escape hatch things. OK. Those are the important ones. But now actually, let's do something in this moment in time. I was asking the question, I was like, how can I access like maybe other InSpec resources? What's available to me inside of this thing? Like, what can I do right now? My favorite command at this point is ls. So pry created sort of like a file system that's sort of, there's a few commands that match to like what you might use inside of a terminal. When you type ls, it's going to give you a bunch of different possible options for you at this moment in time. So over on the right in the white here, it's showing you all the text you could type in, dare I say methods perhaps, like methods you can invoke, like send those messages. And this is just telling you where they come from. This is great if you're ever opening like a ticket or something like that, you're trying to troubleshoot something down. They'll give you a little more detail about where all that stuff comes from. That's particularly difficult in the Ruby community. One of them that's probably the most important for us in this time is, well, hey, we're the Git class. We had that version method. We built that one. But like this one right here, which is the InSpec method. So I'm going to run that one just to kind of see it. There's other things here. We'll talk about more of those as we go along. I'm going to troubleshoot a lot. So I type in the word InSpec. It's going to return to me the variable, essentially, that's there. The method is going to be invoked. It's going to give me an object. I'm going to see that I have the InSpec class. What's really cool is within Ruby, essentially, this is all we're doing Ruby. I have this object. One of the other important things to remember is you can type in the word methods. Methods gives you all the list of the possible things that something can do. I don't like using documentation because it's a big lie. And most of us don't maintain it or anything like that. So this is a great way to be truthful. The other thing is a lot of software applications don't oftentimes have your version in the documentation. They might have the latest version. You might be air-gapped using InSpec 3 point something. This is the lifesaver for you in terms of being able to see the reference to the material when something doesn't seem right. I like asking live code real questions instead of referring to dead documentation. You'll see here that the InSpec thing is going to give me a list of these symbols. The symbols, you can ignore the little colons in front. Really, it just means on the InSpec object, I can call PowerShell, AWS billing. This probably looks familiar, right? This is a list of all the resources that InSpec provides. So I'm going to shortcut and get out of that and just run inspec.command, because that's what I'm familiar with. That's one of my favorite resources. It's going to give me an error message. And the whole thing is it usually takes an actual command that wants to run. So I'm going to run git version inside of here. OK, so it tells me it made a command with the git version, but it didn't give me the output. It doesn't look like it ran or did anything like that. I'm missing one little step. I need to access some piece of it, like standard out, standard error, and exit code, or something like that. I'll just run .standard out. And of course, at this point, it actually performs that operation. So this is kind of how you do within code inside of the InSpec world. I'm doing inspec.command. I do the version. I get the standard out. OK, this is how I program. Copy. I made my own Stack Overflow. Paste. All right. I'm going to store my raw result here. And then the problem is, though, if you're looking at the output, this says git version 2.20.1. It's got some other platform information. We got to do a little bit of string manipulation. So you could solve this problem by doing some string manipulation in the command itself. But of course, watch out. It might not be platform dependent. For those of you who like cuts and TRs and all that stuff in terms of the Linux world. But if that's not a concern, you can totally do that. My case, I think what might be really interesting to do, I'm going to do a trick here because I always forget typing it. So here's the raw result. I'm going to say, well, again, in this live environment, I'm going to try one of these things that I know, which is called split. Split is a way in a Ruby string that I can split something based on a character I give it. By default, it's going to split everything into a bunch of words. So it took the space and kind of split or broke everything in parts. And it looks like I'm not interested in the 0th word or the first word. I'm just interested in the second word. So I'm just going to push the up arrow again. I'm going to say that. Now give me the second word. And there we go. I have my version. So here we are. I'm just going to put that in my final thing. Is this the best solution to the problem? Probably not. But it works, I think. When I'm all done, I type in exit, and then I go. All right, now I'm going to rerun this test, but let's take out the breakpoint. I got to take that out. All right, let's run this again. So before we were faking it, now we have a real one. And actually, even before that, right, I solved the problem by doing like a command resource, and then I refactored it so it was like a Git resource. And now I have the support for this sort of Git version. All right. Oh, you don't have, no, please, no. I just typed. I'd like to thank my middle school for all right, that's a great start of things. We have a solution. There's some other ways we can solve it, of course, regular expressions, other things like that. I like to go into it, but let me pause for a moment and just kind of review what we were doing. I like to do that in terms of like, I didn't make the profile for you. Here I did the thing where just like the basic one, git command, like I made the command git version. I made the profile, I saw everything working. Oh, right, let's not talk about that. The InSpec language. So the InSpec language has a number of other things besides a name, has a description, examples, and supports, but I mostly focus on just getting the bare minimum there, getting the name present. So here's what I wrote. I ran it, and it failed, right? Remember? That's an important step. Okay? And then I implemented it by just doing some pattern matching. This solution involves some sort of regular expressions. I'll use that in the next one for sure. And there we go. We see it passing, using pry along the way to make it easy. So we're going to use a lot of this and repeat the same concept over and over again. I'd like to actually do this now, right? So a lot of times if you use some sort of command or essentially an executable, a service, there's probably a default, but somebody's got to have something different. Perhaps something's a different version, located in a different location. Perhaps maybe something needs to ship with an executable, and you need to use that. So again, Git might not be the practical case for this example, but imagine you're shipping with something or you need to point to another location. What I'd like to say is optionally support another path. So here, I'm going to go back to our example here and say, you know what, where should I use our Git? Let's say, why not user bin Git in the event, and I think that's the Git I'm using anyways. So instead of using the Git on the path, I'm saying please use this specific Git, or at least that's what I'm implying, but I haven't implemented that, right? So I made a small change. I'm going to run this. Oh, this is my favorite part about InSpec. These error messages. This one in particular always gets me because it doesn't really tell me any context about what's happened. It swallowed the error. It's really rough to deal with, particularly if you've made a bunch of changes. That's why I'm saying a lot of times when you're doing these custom resources or any of this exploratory work, make one change at a time just so you don't freak out, because there's a lot of different little things that can give you a problem here. It's telling me there's a wrong number of arguments. I've given it 1, I expected 0. So previously we just had the word Git up there. Now it's Git with a 1 parameter, 1 argument. It's expecting 0. So what we need to do is actually implement a way for our Git resource to take that argument. All right, I'll return to our Git resource here, and let's implement that. So every class, essentially inside of Ruby, gets instantiated or created through an Initialize method. I promise you, you will spell this wrong in your lifetime, and you will lose at least 17 minutes of your life to that. So by defining an initialize method, that's essentially what's there by default. They don't write it because it's just assumed, but that's what you get by default. What we need to do is provide essentially for a way to take a parameter or an argument. In this case, I'm going to provide a path. And that path, I'm going to say, well, here's our path. And you know what? I'm going to use that same path down here. And I know I'm making a mistake, so I know. All right, let's just see this, though, I guess before I make this change, probably. Yeah, let's just do that. I'm going to run this again and see what the result is. It passes. Great. Okay, so we solved the problem, right? Like, that's the implementation. We actually, yeah, right. Like, so there is a problem here. We're using the path, or at least we're providing a path, or providing a place for the path, but we're never using the path. So I could try using the path here, but we'll learn something about the world of programming. I make assumptions about what I know a lot based on my time spent there in programming world. Here we go again. So I'm going to run this again. Any thoughts? Fail? All right. It's telling me that there's an undefined local variable or method path inside of my Git class. So at this moment in time, when Ruby is processing this version function, it gets to the word path and it says, do you have a local variable? No. Do you have a method called path? No. And that's why it's failing. Okay, so but I put a path in the initialize, right? But why doesn't the path make it available here? The thing is, each one of these methods, it's the way that we call it in programming is like scope, maybe. It's probably a good word for it. Scope. I like to think of it as like like little gardens that are fenced off from one another. Essentially, what's happening in here doesn't know anything about what's happening up in there. So we need to find a way that we can pass the information in this instance of a class from one method to another method. And the one way to do that is actually with instance variables. So there's this content or data about an object instance that it knows about itself. It's kind of like knowing your name or knowing your age or knowing some details that you might share about yourself. The class can hold that information. So wait, I know what people are thinking. Set instance var. I'm going to set an instance variable. I'm going to say that's going to be the path, and I'll set it to the path value. I think that's what it is. Well, we'll try it. Oh, and then if I was to use that instance variable, I'll try that. But let's see if this instance var is working. I can't remember. Oh, set instance var. That's not what it is. Is it variable? I never do this approach, but this is fun. Okay, let's forget that for a second. Oh, it's instance variable set. No one uses this. Sorry, everybody. I was trying to prove a point that I thought might be interesting. Yeah, okay. Right here, we have an instance variable set. I set this instance variable. You always have to put the little @ in front of it and the path, and there I stored in the path. Here, I need to do an instance variable get. Okay, so I'm going to instance variable get. I'm going to grab it from the path. Let's grab that path thing, and I'll store it in path, and then I'll execute this. Oh, thanks. That is a common mistake. Oh, yeah, that looks like some good typos. Thanks, Clippy. Oh, speaking of which, wait, one side. Here we go. This is too much. Okay, so there we go. I ran that, and now that works. So we use this sort of process of doing the instance variable set and this instance variable get. Boy, Ruby is such an expressive, lovely language. Actually, it's much easier than this. This is the long way of doing it. I just wanted to make it more clear, perhaps, what I'm about to do, just kind of set up the sort of stage for it. Instead of writing this god-awful piece of code, you can write at path equals path. That's essentially the same as that instance variable set. Oh, right. Thanks, Clippy. All right, there we go. Now, down below, instead of doing this thing about instance variable get, we can just, I got to turn that. All right. I could do that at path. Cool. It's nice. It focuses you where you need to be looking. That's good. OK, let's run this again just to kind of see that work. Great. Yeah, let's turn Clippy off. Sorry, buddy. And we'll turn Power Node. Turn these things off. Sorry. I'll see you tonight. OK. This is what we do in the hotel room. All right, so that's another way of solving the problem, sort of passing information from one to the other, right? The one last thing that you'll probably see common in a lot of resources is perhaps we should expose this externally. So oftentimes what people will do is, you remember it said local variable or method, and we should make it available for things. I might say, let's set up a path, and we'll say at path, and that just returns it. What I'm doing or what I'm implying, and I've been doing this whole time, I'm assuming, that inside of a method, it automatically returns a value. The last line is automatically being returned. You can explicitly define this. A lot of people do that. It's kind of like the people that like to wear belts and suspenders in the Ruby world, but it's a totally acceptable way of solving it. But I'll remove it. I'll leave it on for right now because I like it. I'll leave it on for right now. OK, so I've assigned this function essentially to return this thing. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll remove that. Now, this little piece of code right here, people do this all the time. It's a getter, right? Like programmers always talking about getters and setters. Thanks. And so what we want to do is essentially replace this with like an attr reader. An attr reader is really just replacing all that code that I just did above. So in this case, like that I wrote, that I just deleted, can be replaced with this little bit of code right there. So let me leave it, and I'll just comment that out. Does that make sense? It's kind of like a bunch of shortcuts. So I'm trying to like unpack some of the shortcuts, do this live for you so that when you go back and look at this code, you'll be able to make a distinction to understand that. Now, here's something that I didn't do. I didn't cover the case of like what happens when we use Git without the path, right? So I said, here's Git with a path, but I make it optional. So right here, I'm going to use the Git that's on the path, and then here I'm going to give a specific path to make it work. When I run this again, I should see, right, if I'm programming this correctly, two successes, 3 failures, or something like that. Instead, I get that error message. Now it's the reverse of what I had before. I have given it 0, that 1 on line 8, and then I expected 1. So that's a bit of a problem. So let's go back and look at that class in terms of like how to solve that. This is the common thing that happens. What I want is not a mandatory parameter that gets passed into the function. I want an optional parameter. The only way to do an optional parameter inside of Ruby is essentially give it a default value. An easy thing to do is just assign it to nil. So if you don't give me a value, I'm going to assume it's this value. It doesn't have to be nil. You could say, hey, by default, it's supposed to be user bin git. It could be whatever you want it to be. A lot of times I just go with nil here, and then within the code, I might do something like this. You know what? Let's set the path to either the path that you provide, or if you didn't give us one, just use git. Sometimes it's a little fancy. Somebody might be like, default git path, and just return the word git. So it's a little more clear about what you're reading, if that makes sense. But us programmers. But this line, this like pipe, is just saying, give me this if you have it. Otherwise, just fall through and give me the thing on the other side. Very common that happens in terms of like the world of programming. OK, I'm going to run this again. I think everything should be good at this point, and we should have a successful InSpec, or excuse me, a Git resource that takes a parameter or doesn't take a parameter. Great. All right, so we added the path value here. Oh, that's a capital H. Look at that. All right, and then we added the attribute reader. Again, I used a different way of sort of parsing it, but you'll find different ways that work for you, and that's mostly like reference documentation. Spending some time with strings, regex, and things like that will be super useful. Really what we followed was a test-driven development flow. I expressed a test, I implemented a solution, I verified that the implementation works, and then I refactored, I changed it, right? Very static solution to a very real solution. I strongly encourage you to do this. This is very hard when you're working with something new for the first time, to actually like go slow and make one change at a time. But I encourage you to do that. It's incredible because you can actually see what broke instead of just throwing a bunch of stuff at it. OK, we'll use pry. Pry has the ls, which is super helpful, help and exit. There's a lot more commands. There's ways to step. A lot of you asked questions later about it to me personally and in my life that I've spent time doing this. I'd love to talk about it. There's some great resources at pry REPL. Take a look at it. There's different ways, or very common ways, of dealing with the output. A lot of times I see people stripping things. These words, these verbs are different in different cases. In the Ruby community, I'm not going to cover all of them, but like strip is a really useful one because it strips things from the left and right, essentially the front and back of the string. You can strip from one side or the other if you're interested, L strip or R strip. You might actually grab characters, like a range of characters. I would not suggest this in all cases. But it's useful, right? I'm saying give me things at the 12th character all the way up to the 17th index of the character. That's the version number. That would be really bad if things moved, but it might be the right solution. People would say that's half-assed, but sometimes half the ass is what you need, right? You do this one too. You might say like 12, but then give me 6 characters afterwards. That works as long as we have a 6 version, but essentially what if you're at 14.20 dot, is it 6 characters, 7 characters? That's why I went for sort of like a split approach. A split approach breaks it into words, and then we can kind of take the word that we want. We have to still hope that the words are in the particular position. The more advanced way to talk about it is like to do regular expressions. Regular expressions can be, if you're doing a lot of version work and things like that, this is really useful. This website, Rubular, is the best one to talk to, or talk to Nell Shamrell. She loves talking about regular expressions. I mean, she's done a lot of talks on them, so I'm sure she'll be able to like help you out is what I mean to say. I really do think so. All right, let's go creating a Git repo. We've got like 5 minutes. I'll go quick. All right, let's make another one called Git Repo. I think in Git Repo, what we might do is essentially call this, right? Because Git itself is not that important. Oftentimes, we might be asking like, what's going on in a repo? And so here, I'm going to do a Git Repo resource. I'm going to say, you know what, what's the current branch of this Git repo? But you know the way I was saying that? What's the current branch of this repo? I don't think there's a default here. I think you've got to provide it some path. And in this case, well, you know what? I'll make this a Git repo. So let's git init. Let's git add everything. Let's git commit everything really quick. And now we have a Git repository. Wonderful. So this is the Git repository. You can ask some questions while we're doing development for that. We'll say what the current branch should be. And the current branch looks like it's master according to my terminal. You see that there? That's what it's telling me. All right. And here, I'm going to run this again. Will this pass? No, right? Pessimistic view of the world. I agree with that completely. Everything shouldn't pass. When it does pass, you should be surprised and scared. Okay. It works better that way. Here we go. I'm going to make a new file. It's going to Git Repo. So you notice I'm repeating the pattern here. It'd be nice if there was a generator that did this. All right, Git Repo. I'm going to subclass this whole like InSpec thing. That's a longer conversation. And here's this. We're going to call it the Git Repo. You have to put the name there. If we don't have the name, it's going to not find it. So there we have that. I know that we're going to get the error message related to version, though, right? Like, or not version. We're going to get an error message related to. Oh, I didn't save it. Oh, it's telling me I need a parameter, right? Because if I'm using a Git repo, it's telling me I need to have a path. So hey, we'll just copy that code that we kind of did before, right? Initialize. Sometimes I say it out loud to myself. Initialize to make it work. We need a path. Remember, I used an instance variable. I set a path to that path. And then I did that whole like attribute reader because I was like, oh, I just want to have the path. Now let's save that. I'll run it again. Good. There's no current branch method, so let's add the current branch method. Here we could just say master. But again, let's just cut to like what we want to do. So I'll just say master right here. But what we're going to be doing is something like doing that InSpec interrogation thing again. I know that at this point, probably it's just going to be like inspec.command. I'm going to specify the command. How might you get the current branch? I know that the git branch command will give it to me. So I run git branch. I'll grab the standard out. Again, that looks like it's good. It looks like always the branch will have some sort of asterisk or star character in the front of it. So in this case, here's what I'm looking for. This is the raw result. I'll store it here. There's many ways we could parse these things. Generally, what I'll do is a regular expression. I'll say at the start of the line, there is going to be a star character. But the star character is special in regex, so I need to escape it by putting a little, a little slash behind it. I then know there's going to be a space, and I think there's going to be the name of the branch that follows afterwards. I know that the name of a branch could be any characters, numbers, letters, different things like that. So I'll just use the period character, which just means anything. Then I'll use the plus character, which means give me a bunch of anything. And then I'll use the $ character, which means I'm done with the line. So generally, you get that essentially like a bunch of lines here. This would say, find me the one line that starts with a star, and then just find the word on there. A lot of times I like to name my regular expression groups. The reason why you put the parentheses is sort of define a group. I like to put this, we might be like, here's my branch. Or you might even be like, here's my current branch. But I'll just call it branch, like this. OK, this is one of those things where it's like, hey, why don't I just test this, right? Like inside of here. You could build it live on the fly and say, you know what if I match the output, will that work, of this thing? OK, there it is. It matches. It returns this match data. If it didn't match, it wouldn't return it for me. But you'll notice it says the word branch here. That value I can retrieve master. Like I said, I could talk more about this personally with this. I try not to spend too much time in regex, but this is how I solve the problem. Okay, exit. Okay, so I think that'll work for me. It seems like, oh wait, not the word branch master, but the word branch. Yeah, okay. And that, or dot branch will not work, I'm sorry. This is supposed to be match, the raw result, and then grab the branch off of the match. There we go. This doesn't work in all cases, particularly when you're not on a branch head. I should point out that like everything I'm doing should be under the caveat of like, most resources are really difficult to make and make them right to work for all users in all use cases. I think we're just out of time, but I wanted to add one more little feature here to like add some functionality, so you're feel free to leave if you need to. Here, which is interesting with the Git Repo one, I might want to provide a path that goes along with it. In this case, the Git path that comes with it. So in this case, the Git repo knows nothing about the Git. It essentially performed a Git operation, but it didn't consider the path that it was, how it executed. So we might perform the same thing. Let's give it a user bin Git. I'm going to give it that value, and essentially run the command again. And here we'll see that I should get an error message, because at this point, I've given it 2 parameters, not one of them. And so I just want to show you this last little thing, because this happens a lot of times when working with InSpec resources. They'll have what they'll call as mandatory parameters, and then they'll have a number of sort of options that follow afterwards. And to implement the options that follow afterwards, you need to provide another parameter. And in this case, generally, you want to assign a default value to make sure it's optional. And we'll oftentimes just do equals 2 hipsters kissing, essentially the little mustaches, right, that are there. And that's just going to give you an empty hash as the default value. Remember, I could use nil or anything like that. OK, that should solve the problem of getting the thing there. This is one of those moments. If you're interested, you could pause the execution, see if that's true, and learn more about it. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to store the Git path. And I'm going to store the Git path from the options and grab the Git path out of it. So this is a hash. I'm pulling details out of it. And then, of course, I might be like, well, let's make the Git path available as a function from the instance variable. And then when I come down here, I'm like, oh, I should have used double quotes, right? I might have been like, here's the Git path, and I can replace that value. So this changes the way that that works, and hopefully gives me, a test that pass, and now and like a resource that has a lot of functionality. We can continue on down this path if you'd like to, and go down these sort of resources. But I want to spend just this time here to kind of show you a little bit and demystify a lot of like what you saw essentially in that command control. I ran out of time. There was a lot more to cover in terms of like a Git config resource, but I can show you that if you're interested later at another time. InSpec is wide in terms of like what is available and what's possible. It's really hard to type in write code in InSpec, because a lot of times you're writing in Ruby as well. So you're going to oftentimes be figuring out that important line as your first objective, right? What's Ruby and what's InSpec? Where do I find the answer to this question in this documentation? How do I search for this issue? It would really help, if you understand things, to spend a lot of time in the InSpec documentation. If you're interested more in the tactical approach of how you're using these resources, the Learn Chef Rally thing is there. And of course, the InSpec source code is really great. If you get these sort of basic understandings of the language down, some of the class structure, these methods, if a lot of that made sense for you, or was just almost there, looking at the source code would make a big difference. There's, of course, the Slack channel for InSpec, which is helpful. You can reach out to me on that Slack at Bertlow. I'm also on GitHub at Bertlow, and of course, you can find me on Twitter. Sure. Occasionally, I talk about Magic the Gathering. I don't know. There's a few little projects I might mention or something like that. If you're interested in a remote-only OHI, you can go check out this project I've been working on. It's a little sub-project called OBI. It's kind of like OHI from a train. I was going to, because you're using the train tool to, hey, but you're just driving away. If you're interested in testing some of your OHI plugins, I don't know how I got into this whole OHI world, but when I was there at Chef, I started testing some OHI plugins. I actually have some work to test these Chef, essentially these InSpec resources. So if you're interested in a little demo or some hanging out or some questions, something like that, a lot of times we're saying now in the InSpec community, generate your profile, but don't do this. Don't essentially put all your stuff in there, your controls alongside of these resources. And I don't know how you test that stuff if you don't have some control to test it. So I've come up with a way to unit test it inside of one of my essentially cookbooks. If you'd like a link to that, just grab me. I can find you a link and point you to what that code I'm working on. I eventually like to codify it, make it something bigger and more important if it's useful to other people. And then, of course, the theme here is synthwave with power. Synthwave 84. That's how you get the neon glow. If anyone wants to see it up close on my screen, it looks really hot. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you at the conference and other places.